Alright guys, so this video is part 2 of my previous video, so if you haven't seen that already, then you should consider checking that video out either before or after watching this one, as it contains a great deal of context which you will probably find very illuminating. Be sure to like and subscribe, and consider subscribing to my Patreon if you want to help out, and without any further ado, let's get into it. Every scientific man, in order to preserve his reputation, has to say he dislikes metaphysics. What he means is he dislikes having his metaphysics criticized. Alfred Whitehead. Previously, I described the ways in which Descartes' philosophy resulted in what we could call a bifurcation of nature, which separated the world into two distinct metaphysical realms, that of mind and that of matter. But it was another philosopher who would see most clearly the problems which were developing from this modernist post-Cartesian paradigm, and who would codify many of the conceptual elements which would come to characterize modern thought for centuries to come. That philosopher was Immanuel Kant. Through David Hume, Kant would come to see the true extent of the implications wrought by Descartes' systematic skepticism. If we cannot be certain that our experiences of the world actually coincide with a world beyond our perceptions, then how can we justify any of our empirical claims about the world at all? How do we know that any of our scientific claims actually have any objective validity? Kant saw that such knowledge about the world would require more than empirical observation. We can observe that the sun has risen every day up until now, but we cannot simply observe a law which demands such regularity. We must infer such laws, and thus empirical observation alone is not enough to actually ground scientific knowledge. Nor can we say that the constancy of the sun's behavior is dictated by logic, as Kant understood logical truths to apply only to relations of ideas rather than facts about the natural world. Kant's solution was to make a distinction, much like Descartes' distinction between mind and matter, between what he termed phenomena and noumena. For Kant, the world of phenomena was the world of experience. The phenomenal world is the world as we experience it, the world as it is conditioned by our faculties of perception and understanding. Kant saw that the human psyche itself played a crucial role in synthesizing our sense perceptions together into intelligible experiences. Much like the way that the Copernican revolution came to place the sun at the center of the solar system, the Kantian revolution placed the human psyche at the center of the world which we actually experience. According to Kant, we did not experience the world in itself, but rather experienced phenomena, experiences of the world which were necessarily conditioned by the functioning of the human mind in consistent ways. By understanding the way that the human mind conditioned our experiences, Kant could, in a sense, reclaim objectivity and thereby reground science in the wake of Cartesian and Humean radical skepticism. Hume had argued that we never actually experienced causation or time, and thus argued that we inferred those aspects of reality in an irrational way. Kant instead argued that space, time, and causality were all among a variety of categories which the human mind necessarily used to condition our experiences of the world. Space, time, and causation, argued Kant, were not necessarily aspects of the world in itself, but were, at the very least, necessary aspects of the way that the human mind structures our experiences of reality. Those aspects were therefore necessary aspects of the phenomenal world, the world which we experience, but not necessarily the world in itself. But then what about the world as it actually is? What about this presupposed ding en sich, or thing in itself, which Kant's supposed to lie somewhere behind or beneath the phenomenal world of experiences? Within this Kantian understanding of reality, we never actually encounter the world as it is in itself, but only phenomena. The world itself is something which would thus seem to be forever beyond our reach. We cannot go around our experiences to check if our experiences of the world actually correspond to how the world actually is. Although Kant believed that he had rescued science from radical skepticism, there remains a looming epistemological nihilism behind Kant's ideas. What if there is no world in itself? If we, by definition, cannot encounter such a world, then what reason do we really have to believe that there is such a thing in itself at all? Now, of course, this all might seem rather pedantic. It seems rather obvious that there is indeed a world beyond our experiences of the world. The world remains even after we look away and return our gaze to it. Brick walls stop foreheads regardless as to how our consciousness construes them. But what we are seeing here in this problem is yet another unfolding of the deeply rooted incoherence of the Cartesian worldview. Kant's demarcation of phenomena and noumena is a kind of reformulation of the Cartesian split between mind and matter. Another split which would seem to create an infinitely vast and unbridgeable gulf between our consciousness and the world which we inhabit. Kant had no choice but to resign himself to a kind of epistemological quietism with regards to the world beyond our senses. He deeply held that there must be an actual world which exists independently of our experiences, but he saw no way to actually say anything about that world. The world would have to remain forever beyond our grasp, an impenetrable mystery which would always lie beyond the confines of our minds. The paradigm of modern science presupposes that what lies beyond our consciousness is something we call matter, which is supposed to be entirely objective in character, that which exists independently of our senses. Yet Kant had shown us that we can never actually encounter matter at all, but rather only our experiences of an unknowable something which we can only presume to exist beyond our own minds. Following Kant, many philosophers would come to reject or reformulate Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena in such a way that this intractable gulf could be mended. One of those philosophers was Henri Bergson. Initially educated as a mathematician and later developing an acute interest in the French spiritualism movement, which would also give us figures such as Jean Gebser, Henri Bergson rejected outright the Cartesian conception of mind as a kind of screen, which separated us intractably from a world which was believed to be entirely devoid of consciousness. In aiming for the heart of this issue, Bergson asks us in his monumental work, Matter and Memory, to think about what matter must actually be given the way in which we actually experience the world around us. We begin with our experiences of the world. We can then divert our attention from the world temporarily and return to see that the objects of the world yet remain. We thus rightly conclude that the world is not merely a projection of our minds. There is something out there, as it were, which is provided to our consciousness. But what exactly is it that is provided by the world? The answer is, of course, experiences. There is never anything extra which we encounter by definition, and thus Bergson concludes that matter, that which is there when we are not looking, consists of latent, potential experiences. Now, at first, this might seem a bit odd, but let us think about what an experience really is. It is the feeling of a relationship between ourselves and the objects which constitute the world. Thus, to say that matter is comprised of potential or latent experiences is to say that the objectivity of matter consists precisely in its potential for coming into such relationships. And simply following through more fully on the implications hidden within Cartesian dualism, Bergson thus came to essentially turn inside out the Cartesian and Kantian formulations of the bifurcation of nature, such that mind and matter were now seen to be necessarily codependent and interpenetrating. After all, what else could matter possibly be other than experiences that have yet to become actualized? There are many implications which then unfold from re-synthesizing mind and matter in this way. In following Bergson, we can see that subjectivity is in fact a fundamental aspect of reality itself, and that complex minds such as our own do not in fact have a monopoly on experience. And following through on the ontological implications of the nature of our own existence, we come to see that experience itself is in fact a fundamental aspect of the world itself. Bergson would then go on to formulate a very different sort of fundamental dichotomy, not between mind and matter, but rather between the mechanical and the organic. For Bergson, mechanical causation is that in which an event is determined entirely by preceding events, as in the case of falling dominoes or billiard balls bouncing off of one another. It is the realm of the mechanistic that science has striven to prioritize since its initial conception within Cartesian philosophy, but science often overextends itself in attempting to describe the organic aspects of reality as though the organic were merely a more complex form of the mechanistic. Rather, Bergson saw the organic as always being in a kind of dynamic relationship with the past or the future, or both. It is not only the immediately preceding moment which determines an organic behavior, but rather organic systems are able to draw from a kind of embodied memory, which extends much further into the past. Organic activity is therefore much more than the mechanistic sequence of immediately prior events determining immediately subsequent events. We see this concept illustrated by these cone-like diagrams which Bergson employed within matter and memory. We can also see that these cones can stretch upward as well as downward, indicating that organisms are also capable of bringing possible futures into relation with the present in much the same way that they are able to bring the past into relation with the present. It would be this Bergsonian conception of organic memory which would later inspire Rupert Sheldrake's development of morphic resonance theory, which we explored in a previous series on this channel. Tufts University biologist Michael Levin has also employed very similar ideas and even very similar diagrammatic illustrations in his theoretical work regarding what he has dubbed cognitive light cones. What is most significant for our purposes here, however, is the manner in which Bergson's metaphysics collapses mind and matter back into one another in such a manner that experientiality is seen to be a fundamental aspect of nature itself. In correspondence to this fusion of mind and matter, there is also a correlative fissioning apart of the organic and the mechanistic. Rather than seeing organisms as squishy, complex machines, Bergson saw a very real divide between processes which were merely mechanistic and those which were genuinely alive, organic, or animate. But now I want us to turn our attention to a philosopher who would go even further than Bergson or any other thinker in his attempt to mend the Cartesian rupture between mind and matter, and who would lay the groundwork for what is today an entire field of philosophy, now known often as process philosophy or process metaphysics. Here I am referring to the British mathematician and metaphysician Alfred North Whitehead, one of the single most titanic figures within the early development of what we now term analytic philosophy, but who described his own philosophical system not as process philosophy nor as analytic philosophy, but rather as a philosophy of organism. Whitehead himself was very closely interested and involved within the developments of physics, which had begun to take shape in the early 20th century. Developments which would culminate in what we now refer to as quantum electrodynamics or quantum field theory, as well as the theory of general relativity. Both Henri Bergson and Whitehead would be very outspoken critics of what they saw as the implicit metaphysics of Einstein's general relativity, and Whitehead himself would develop an alternative conception of gravity and relativity, which he believed would avoid the pitfalls of Einstein's conception, particularly the so-called black holes, which Einstein himself believed to be a refutation of his own conception of relativity, rather than a natural inference from it. But overall, Whitehead was a thinker who, perhaps more so than any other thinker of his own time or since, saw the writing on the walls very clearly. The metaphysical paradigm which had dominated science since the days of Descartes simply would not survive the developments in physics which were now being substantiated by precise measurements and experimental observations. The Enlightenment vision of the clockwork universe and clockmaker God were no longer adequate in accounting for the world which was coming to be revealed by the science which had stemmed from that vision. A new vision was needed, as was a new conceptual framework, and Whitehead would set himself the task of developing just such a conceptual system. In 1924, Whitehead would relocate to the United States, where, at Harvard University, he would begin his philosophical project in earnest. In 1925, Whitehead would publish Science and the Modern World, in which Whitehead would begin developing his critique of and alternative to Cartesian dualism. In 1927, Whitehead would present his more formalized ideas as a series of lectures, which in 1929 would be published as Process and Reality, a work which is now generally considered to be Whitehead's magnum opus and the most rigorous articulation of the metaphysical scheme which he had come to develop. Alright guys, so I am not going to sugarcoat this. I am about to throw some very dense and nuanced terminology at you guys that will probably seem very alien and counterintuitive if you've never encountered Whitehead's ideas before, so bear with me. There is a bit of jargon to unpack here, but these ideas really are not that complicated. If they seem difficult, it's not because any of this is particularly arcane or bizarre. Rather, it's because of how dramatically Whitehead's ideas stand in contrast to the implicit presumptions which remain the accepted doctrines of the post-Cartesian modernist worldview. As previously mentioned, Whitehead refers to the system developed in Process and Reality as a philosophy of organism, and this nomenclature indicates that Whitehead had come to see the fundamental nature of the world as organic, rather than consisting fundamentally of lifeless, inert material as implied by the Cartesian paradigm which he sought to subvert. In Process and Reality, Whitehead is attempting to rigorously describe a reality which he saw as inexorably alive, even at the most basic level. Most central to Whitehead's system is a concept which he refers to as concrescence, a term which refers to what Whitehead saw as the fundamental nature of time. Concrescence implies a synthesis or coming together of actualities and potentialities, which thereby come to concretize and thus form the basic units of the world, which he variously termed actual occasions, actual entities, or electromagnetic occasions of experience. As we also saw in Bergson's metaphysics, we can see in Whitehead's scheme the implication that reality is characterized by both objectivity and subjectivity, even at the most basic level. But moreover, Whitehead is also indicating that the most basic elements of the world are events, rather than enduring material objects. Rather than picturing nature as made up of tiny BBs bouncing around in the void, Whitehead was taking the implications of quantum physics seriously, and thus concluding that the fundamental entities of the world are processes rather than material bodies. An actual event is formed by the process of concrescence, and the nature of that process is determined by relationships which Whitehead calls prehensions. The word prehension, similar to the word apprehension, etymologically implies grasping or taking up. Prehensions are the basic forms of interaction which give shape to actual events and allow for the achievement of determinacy from distributions or fields of indeterminacy. This concretization corresponds to what physicists would describe as wave function collapse. Whitehead describes three types of prehension: physical prehension, conceptual prehension, and hybrid prehension. These are the basic components of what Whitehead describes as a theory of feelings. I'm going to briefly describe the first two types of prehension here, but the third type, hybrid prehension, is a bit more complicated, and so that's something which we will be coming back to in later videos. Physical prehension consists in relationships between an organic process and actual occasions which have already occurred, and which have thus already come to be concretized as determinate events within the past. Past actualities contribute themselves to a novel moment of creative genesis, and this is the process which we commonly describe as physical causation, or efficient teleology, to use Aristotelian terms. In contrast to physical prehension, we then have conceptual prehension. Conceptual prehension is the experience of possibilities rather than past actualities. It is the feeling of real potentialities which are available to a given concrescence, a given moment of experience. Whitehead describes these potentialities as eternal objects, which are essentially equivalent to Platonic forms. They are the basic structures or patterns which an event can incorporate into itself so as to thereby achieve concrete determinacy. An occasion of concrescence is fundamentally an experiential decision in which the event actively selects which possibilities come to give shape to it, as it then concretizes and then becomes a definite feature of the past. So let's now try to make sense of all that by actually looking at how this scheme might map on to the basic features of our world. Quantum mechanics describes the world as consisting fundamentally of fields and particles. The word particle, however, is already itself something of an issue, as the word particle is something that we intuitively take to refer to a material body of some sort, a physically enduring BB of some sort. As previously indicated, Whitehead's scheme is one in which the basic elements are events rather than material bodies. You can find this conceptual convolution present in almost any discussions pertaining to quantum mechanics. Physicists speak of quantum particles as though they are physical bodies, and with the next breath tell us that these particles can be distributed throughout space, that they can be in various locations at the same time. Particles are also described as point-like, meaning that they are said to have no physical extension in space, even though they are also implied to be physical bodies which have properties such as mass. Seen through Whitehead's conceptual scheme, however, what we instead find are distributions of real potentiality and fully determinate events. For example, physicists will often describe the electron orbital shell of an atom as a distribution of probability which radiates outward from the atomic nucleus. There is a material, or at least quasi-material body, which we call the electron particle, but this so-called particle exists throughout this distributional aura until a particular interaction event occurs, at which point the electron will indeed come to be at a particular location in space, at least for that particular moment. Within Whitehead's scheme, however, there simply are no material or quasi-material bodies which underlie such quantum phenomena. There are fields, which are distributions of possible events, and then there are the actual events themselves, the electromagnetic occasions of experience. These events are experiential, decisive, and essentially organic processes, which can come to loop back upon themselves so as to form recurrent, cyclical, oscillatory patterns. Knots of electromagnetic process, as it were, which, when sufficiently rigidified, begin to behave in a manner analogous to what we would expect from enduring physical bodies. The electronic field which surrounds the atom is thus not a particle which is in numerous places all at once, but rather it is a range of possible locations in which electromagnetic events could possibly occur. These events then condition the structure of future possibilities, and thus condition the nature of subsequent events. But this efficient determination is never complete. The electromagnetic occasions of experience always have options, and this is the nature of the fundamental indeterminacy which we find in quantum electrodynamics. Within the philosophy of organism, the basic structure of human experience is also the basic structure of the world itself. We are living beings, and reality itself shares in this character with us. There is no intraversible gulf between the nature of our own existence and the nature of the world. To be a subject within an objective reality is simply to be a participant within the ongoing creative advance of the cosmos which we are a part of. As Whitehead states in Science in the Modern World, quote, "Biology is the study of the larger organisms, whereas physics is the study of the smaller organisms," end quote. Quantum events are the most basic organic processes which constitute the world, and atoms are the most basic organisms, the most basic self-referential knots comprised of such organic events. For Whitehead, nature is organic in the sense that it is fundamentally experiential, but also in that it is fundamentally self-creative. It is characterized by what the biologist Francisco Varela would call autopoiesis. For Whitehead, time itself is a creative advance through which nature continually strives towards the actualization of ever more complex and synergistic novelty. Mere mechanistic causation is the exception, not the rule, within such a universe. Organic processes strive to sustain and perpetuate themselves, and in doing so come to form symbiotic relationships with one another, thereby giving rise to ever more complex organisms with ever more richly nuanced experiences. Whitehead's paradigm is one in which biological organisms are but one particular branch of a tree of life which includes atoms as well as stars, planetary systems, and galaxies. At all levels, what we find are self-organizing and self-creative electromagnetic systems which come to synchronize the diversity of nature into complex, living unities. Now that all might sound like a bunch of poetic gobbledygook if you're new to these ideas, and I'm gonna abstain from making this video 2 hours long by unpacking them even further, for now at least. However, if you want to see these principles in action, then I'd recommend checking out my video series on Rupert Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance, in which I also talk a bit about Michael Levin's research regarding bioelectricity. Both Sheldrake and Levin are contemporary standard bearers for this more organismic conception of the world. I would also recommend checking out some of the ideas developed by adherents of the electric universe model of cosmology, which has been an attempt to understand astrophysical phenomena in terms of electro-organic self-organization. As data collected by the James Webb Space Telescope continues to make it increasingly undeniable that our current mechanistic cosmology is in an inescapable crisis, I think it is now more important than ever that we take very seriously the thinkers who saw in advance the problems which are intrinsic to the underlying presumptions of modern science, Bergson and Whitehead being only two of many such figures. Within an organismic rather than mechanistic paradigm, we avoid the intractable problems of somehow deriving consciousness from inanimate matter, as we can see that the world simply is not comprised of inanimate matter, but rather of animate processes which are themselves already experiential in character. Consciousness and existence are intertwined from their very foundations. We can see that we don't need to wait for some arcane mathematical models in order to understand consciousness scientifically. Seen correctly, disciplines such as biology and physics already are the study of consciousness. I'll be leaving it at that for now, however, so thanks for watching and have a great week. I'll see you in the next video.